Thank the representative of Algeria for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
I thank you for convening this urgent meeting of the Security Council at the request of Denmark, France, Greece, Slovenia, and the United Kingdom. I also thank Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher and UNICEF's Executive Director, Catherine Russell, for their sobering and important briefings. I also thank them and the humanitarian workers for their sacrificial work. On the tragic humanitarian situation in Gaza, it is important to reiterate that for Sierra Leone, we speak not as a distant observer, but as a state with deep understanding of the horrors of conflict, impunity, and international indifference. We understand too well what it means when the international humanitarian law is disregarded and when civilians are left defenseless. We speak from that place of experience, empathy, and enduring responsibility, committed to the protection of civilians, the preservation of international law, and the pursuit of peace with justice. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is beyond catastrophic. It is inhumane and indefensible. We know that in the response to indeed the brutal and condemnable attacks of 7th October 2023 and the unlawful taking of hostages by Hamas and other armed groups, acts of terror which we have condemned, the State of Israel's military operations in Gaza have resulted in the death of over 58,000 Palestinians, including over 17,000 children, 10,000 women, and 4,000 elderly persons. No vulnerable or protected group has been spared from the brutality. Over 139,000 people have been injured, most of them women and children, and more than 9,000 remain missing, presumed buried under rubble. These are not abstract statistics. They are lives lost, family devastated, and futures erased. With the restrictions imposed on UN aid distribution and the commencement of food distribution by the euphemized Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in late May 2025, we continue to express grave concern over reports indicating that over 700 Palestinian civilians have been killed near aid distribution points, with over 600 of those fatalities occurring at or around GHF-operated sites. These tragic deaths resulting from stampedes, crush injuries, and the use of live ammunition by Israeli forces and contracted security personnel underscore the urgent need for the protection of humanitarian operations and the civilians they intend to serve. The rising toll is not an unfortunate side effect of conflict, nor collateral damage, but the result of deliberate policies that deprive civilians of their most basic rights. The ongoing siege, collective punishment, targeting of infrastructure, denial of humanitarian access, and the use of starvation as a method of warfare all constitute grave breaches of international humanitarian law. IHL is unambiguous. The Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits collective punishment and places obligations on occupying powers to ensure the provision of food, medical care, and essential services. Additional Protocol 1 of 1977 under Article 54 explicitly prohibits the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, applicable in this case, defines the intentional starvation of civilians by impeding relief supplies as a war crime. The Genocide Convention of 1948 under Article 2C defines deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part as a constituent element of genocide. These obligations are binding on the parties. The International Court of Justice, in the case of South Africa versus Israel, has issued provisional measures ordering the government of Israel to permit humanitarian assistance. These measures are also binding. They must be respected. But they have been and are being continually disregarded at best. This Council has a responsibility to ensure compliance. International jurisprudence, including from the ICTY, has affirmed that the denial of food, water, shelter, and medical care, especially when accompanied by widespread destruction and forced displacement, can constitute evidence of genocidal acts. The Appeals Chamber, dealing with the Srebrenica genocide, cited such conditions in determining genocidal intent. It bears repeating that the obligation to prevent genocide is a preemptory norm of international law and is erga omnes, owed by all states to the international community as a whole. This duty requires not only abstention from acts of genocide, but also proactive measures to prevent such crimes where there is a serious risk of their occurrence. Accordingly, a blanket refutation, consistent denial, are not a sufficient response to an erga omnes obligation. The pattern of mass civilian killings, obstruction of humanitarian aid, and the systemic targeting of life-sustaining infrastructure in Gaza must be examined within this prism. Indeed, today in Gaza, we see indicators of prolonged bombardment, the destruction of crops and wells, targeted killings of journalists and humanitarian workers, the cutting of fuel, water, and electricity supplies, and public calls by senior officials of the government of Israel for the displacement of the population. These acts, taken cumulatively, raise serious concerns about both international humanitarian law and international criminal law. Inaction, therefore, in the face of such grave breaches, undermine the collective commitment of states under the Genocide Convention and the UN Charter, and risk eroding the foundational principles of our shared humanity. Mr. President, Sierra Leone urges this Council to act decisively and without delay. We call on the members of this Council with the means to do so to act. The rules-based international order must not be sacrificed to inertia or geopolitics. We therefore call for, first, a complete cessation of hostilities and the initiation of a credible, irreversible political process leading to a permanent ceasefire. Second, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, including Israeli civilians held by Hamas and Palestinian detainees held without due process. Third, an immediate and unconditional lifting of the aid restrictions and restoration of full and unhindered humanitarian access. We therefore welcome the announcement of the agreement between the State of Israel and the European Union last week to expand the entry of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip through multiple crossings, allow for the repair of critical infrastructure, and ensure the protection of aid workers. Fourth, full compliance with the International Court of Justice provisional measures, including those mandating the facilitation of humanitarian assistance. Equally important is the implementation of all relevant resolutions of the Security Council, including 2712, 2720, and 2735. These resolutions are still valid and binding on the parties. Fifth, independent, impartial, and transparent investigations into all alleged violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, including a call for an immediate investigation into the fatalities at GHF aid distribution sites and convoys. Sierra Leone commends the ongoing diplomatic efforts, including those led by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, to achieve a ceasefire and scale up aid delivery. We also welcome the joint reconvening by France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia of the postponed international conference on the establishment of the Palestinian statehood and a two-state solution. We affirm our support for the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and for a two-state solution. In closing, Mr. President, we must note that this Council, in just 2 generations, must not be remembered for what it again failed to prevent. We must endeavor to discharge our responsibility until relief reaches Gaza, the hostages are released, and hostility ceases. In the face of current inaction, we must also not be silent. As we recall the solemn words of never again, it must apply universally to all peoples, in all places, and at all times, in particular to the people of Palestine,